we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Freud was right about intrusive thoughts. Anyways, we are back from the break.
Yeah.
No, we are highly caffeinated and awake for once because we actually, or at least I rested. Hannah is about to turn in, so Hannah is not well rested.
I am like just over 5 months left of this PhD. My mind and soul are slowly breaking apart. A few weeks ago, I posted on Twitter saying that, like, what do you do for eye strain? So I don't think I've ever said it on the podcast, but I'm doing my PhD unfunded. So I work 30 hours a week. Outside of that, I do PhD work. And then all my relaxation is screen-based.
And also she does the podcast. She's an insane person.
Yeah, insane. So I was like, what do you do for eye strain? And somebody commented and was like, are you sure you just don't need glasses? And I was like, there's no way. And I went to the opticians. I keep forgetting.
Yes.
I keep like trying to add anything onto the end of op and hoping it's the right one. So
You're correct. Don't worry.
So I went to the opticians and he was like doing the slides. So putting the lenses in front of my eyes. And
The eye exam.
Yeah, the whole eye exam. By the way, that was the most stressful thing. He was like, this one, this one, this one. I was like, am I supposed to reply? Like, what is happening here? And so, but he was going really fast. So I did this. And then I was like, holy hell. I cannot see. And then when I got my glasses a week later, she was like, look over there and read that. And I looked and I was like, oh, it's a tiny bit blurry. And she said, take glasses off. And I was like, oh my God, I can't read it. So it turns out, yeah, I haven't been able to see probably for a long time.
Yeah.
I didn't realize. And then the week after, like while I was waiting for the glasses to be made, I was looking around and going, oh my God, I literally can't see. What's been going on?
No, what's funny is that also a close friend of ours, the same thing happened to her, and she drives.
They kept saying, do you drive? And I was like, no. And they were like, thank God. Literally. So just PSA, if you are struggling with your eyes, go get an eye test.
I just love that you also skipped over the funniest of the replies to that tweet that you sent out, which was the person telling
People
you
like,
to choose a different hobby.
Yeah, people were like, go get an actual hobby. And I was like, rude.
You're like, no.
I know you are probably correct, but I also don't want a different hobby.
If you're wondering what hobby it is, Hannah's a huge gamer girl.
I literally just game, I watch TV, and I look at my phone, and I play this block game that is taking over my life.
With that block game.
Yeah, it's too much. I should probably like ban it off my phone because whenever I'm feeling the slight amount of stress, I turn to the blocks.
Yeah, no, I'm having like a difficult, this is now to turn to difficult having hobbies that are not screen-based podcast, because my hobby is writing fiction. And I haven't been able to write because every single time I open up my laptop, I'm like, oh yeah, I have to write a thesis.
You're like, wait.
So now I'm like, I want another hobby, but like, it's hard.
How do you pick up a hobby?
How do you pick up a hobby that's free?
Literally, this is the thing, because I love like drawing and painting. That costs money.
And I can't run anymore because I keep like messing up my knees. Anyways, I'm an old person. Today we're talking about Freud.
Yeah. Today it's Freud. Yeah. So we're talking about Sigmund Freud's 1920s text, Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Yeah, this was a bit of my recommendation because we had been reading a lot of queer theory last season, and I went up to Hannah. I was like, you really can't have queer theory without Freud, even though they reject Freud, but he's kind of involved. And I just think it's like a big text that is going to be used throughout everything we do in the 20th century. So I thought, it's a short enough text. It's pretty short. It reads very easily.
I think it's like 58 pages in total.
Yeah, and it's wild.
Yeah, it's very wild.
Yeah, it's not my first time reading this. I hadn't read it in like 10 years because I read this as an undergrad. So it was sort of like reading it anew. But as someone had never read this, had you read Freud before, actually?
I think I've read some Freud. I've mostly read people who talk about Freud, you know what I mean? Like, because I have taught modules where Freud's been a part of the discussion.
More than likely
people talking.
And also Freud. More than likely attached to Lacan.
Yeah. And so, so it was my first time reading Freud. I've got to be honest, like every module I've taught in, they've took a kind of more negative approach to Freud. And so I expected a certain thing, and I actually was pleasantly surprised. And I've done, me and Paolo were discussing it before we started recording. I've done actually a lot of preparation because every word I didn't understand, which was many. I am not a psychology person. I'm not a medicine person, you know. I didn't understand a lot of the words. So every word that I didn't understand, I looked up and have got a definition for it. And then I had a wild revelation about the media that we're going to discuss at the end. We've got some really fascinating ones. So I think Freud is a really interesting jumping off point to get you thinking.
Also kind of accidentally goes with, this is now our second season, and once more we accidentally kind of fell into a theme. We stumbled on, which is like a little bit of post-structuralism, because we're going to be doing a future episode on Julia Kristeva, and like I was reading this and I couldn't help but to think of like powers of horror. Mm-hmm. So it's Freud is a weird little backbone into contemporary theory, and you cannot change my mind. Do I agree with him? No, absolutely not.
He was just like, let me figure out. He's very intelligent. We're gonna give a little bio on him and stuff like that. He is obviously very intelligent, but he's also very much a product of his time and thinking around how people think.
And violently so, in a way, because he stuck to his guns. He was like, no, we have to do this, 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 and this. And fundamentally, he was wrong. But also a bunch of people at this time period were wrong.
Yeah, literally, it's how science works.
Anyway, yeah. So I guess let's start with, what I was going to also say is I was originally supposed to be sort of heading this discussion, and Hannah researched her way into now being the lead.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how this happened.
It's so much fun. So take it away, Hannah.
So the main source I am pulling a lot of information from today, and also a lot of information of who Freud was. Like, most of my information is coming from the Sigmund Freud Museum in London, which, by the way, their website is excellent. Like, it's
very good. Also a good museum.
Yeah. Really fantastic. So
Freud was born on the 6th of May in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia. Current day, it is February. I believe. I'm not good with my Czech, so sorry to my supervisor. So it's contemporarily the Czech Republic to a family of Jewish wool merchants.
Yeah. So then his family moved to Vienna in 1860. That was where he spent most of his life. He went to school, studied medicine at the University of Vienna. In 1886, he married Martha Bernays, and they went on to have 6 children and 8 grandchildren. Yeah, it's a lot of children.
That's a lot of kids.
But side note, we're going to step away from Freud just to talk about his children and his nephew, because they are so fascinating. So I'm not going to talk about all of them. So one of the children is Anna Freud, who is a particularly well-known family member. She also went into psychoanalysis, same as Freud, and is known as one of the founders, I guess, of psychoanalytic child psychology. Mm-hmm. Super interesting. I believe there's also a charity that set up the Anna Freud charity. But even more interesting to me specifically, his nephew is Edward Bernays, who was a pioneer American publicist who developed the idea of a professional public relations counselor as somebody who drew on social sciences and who was motivated by kind of shaping the response of a general or particular audience. Basically, he mixed propaganda and marketing. One of the most wild things this guy did, he came up with a marketing campaign because basically cigarette companies wanted to advertise to women, and women, because it wasn't proper to be seen as smoking, they didn't want to smoke. So he came up with a campaign that's linked cigarettes to women's liberation, feminism, and freedom. I'm going to put some stuff in the show notes just in case you want to go off on that tangent, because it's so interesting.
The way I would have fallen for that campaign. You know how I love a little cheeky cigarette.
So yeah, wild. So the Freud family is full of
fascinating
wild people. Very
and
fascinating.
obviously there's a lot of speculation about Anna Freud, and if you want to go down that rabbit hole, we invite you to, but we're not going to be discussing it here, even though it's kind of relevant to today's text.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, musings about Anna Freud's sexuality. So you go Google away.
Mm-hmm.
But Sigmund Freud was particularly interested in neurology. He trained in neuropathy at Vienna General Hospital, and he's most well known for being the founder of psychoanalysis, which is a theory of how the mind works and a method of helping people in mental distress. He articulated the psychoanalytic theory of motivation, mental illness, and the structure of the subconscious, and posited that normal and abnormal thought and behavior are guided by irrational and largely hidden forces. He ended up having to move out of Austria when the Nazis took over in 1938. He was forced to flee, and he died on the 23rd of September 1939 at his home in London, which is actually now the Freud Museum. So very interesting. Key works of his include The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life in 1901, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in 1905, Jokes and their relation to the unconscious, 1905, Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, and Civilization and Its Discontents in 1931. Those aren't his only things that he's done. So,
also, kind of amazing that he stayed in Germany till 1938.
Yeah, literally.
Right on the brink of war.
Yeah.
Because, like, Hitler took over in 33.
Very interesting.
I'm like, Freud, baby, get out of there.
So, yeah, we're covering Beyond the Pleasure Principle today. It was published after World War I, which is really key to mention as a kind of key theme that comes up in this book. And it's not named this, but is especially like conversations around post-traumatic stress disorder. Key to note that PTSD was not actually added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1980. So it's not around during his time, but that's basically what he's trying to get at.
Yeah, it was referred to as shell shock. So basically, Freud was seeing a lot of men come back from the war absolutely shattered. We've mentioned it before on the podcast, but the First World War is extremely violent. It's the first truly modern war in which chemical warfare was involved, like exchange of machinery. People were still in horses, and yet we were throwing mustard gas. It was this place of extreme boredom and also hyper-violence. And when you're coming back as the losers of a war and your country is in shambles and you no longer have a Kaiser, and on top of that, like, there is mass starvation, people have no limbs, people are coming back without noses and, you know, without fingers, and, you know, it is a horror show what you are returning to, and having to experience all these things and try to return to a normal everyday life. These things are not possible. So it's sort of like what we have today with veterans of wars, experienced even in my own family, where certain noises, certain things can trigger memories of war, and it can go from sound to smell to certain words. So certain things are being triggering, and it is a very different thing coming back. So when people are coming back, they're not coming back very well.
Yeah.
So Freud is looking at all of this and seeing that there is an antithesis to pleasure, and that is dismay, and that is trauma, and that is anxiety, which he treats very curiously throughout the text, because he's sort of having trouble finding the exact words to describe it. But he's using these sensations that I think are more relatable, because instead of just saying a definition, he's describing the aura of that thing. and how like it cannot be fully explained because they really can't. How do you explain anxiety? You can explain the symptoms, but unless you actually feel it, you don't really know what it is.
Yeah. And he's particularly interested, I guess, also in why anxiety is triggered, or, you know, like you were saying, if a noise sets off memories of war, why your mind would even do that. Like, what purpose does that have? Particularly as he's previously, you know, theorized about the pleasure principle, and I will define that in a minute, I promise. But he's previously kind of based his assumptions around a drive towards pleasure. And so he's trying to understand this isn't pleasurable to do that. It serves no productive purpose. So like, why?
It's a reductive thing. You're supposed to be moving on, but there's certain triggers or certain traumas that bring you all the way back into that primal state. And that's sort of where he's really focusing in on this text. And it's known to be one of his more wilder texts because he's also having a bit of difficulty explaining this. Because before, I feel like he was treating a lot of women and a lot of like bourgeois people in his office chairs. So it's all these illnesses that are not comparable to that of a soldier because of class, race, religion, etc. So on top of that, you add extreme cases of violence or experiencing violence. So it's not just soldiers, but also people that have experienced things in like a nearby city, or they find out details of how their relative passed away and they have PTSD from that as well. So it is a really complex problem now. And he's sort of just trying to get his teeth into it, but really can't. It's slippery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the texts I read kind of summaries from was Susan Sugarman's 2016 text, What Freud Really Meant, which was really helpful. But Sugarman actually states that this work, by Freud's own admission, is one of his most speculative, far-fetched, because especially when he's trying to define this like death instinct, death drive, because it's very obscure what he's trying to do. And we'll talk about it a bit later, but the end of the text is particularly interesting. I thought it was really fascinating. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he, as well as drawing on kind of his own experiences and his experiences practicing medicine, like he draws on some case studies at some point. He is also drawing on microbiology, speculative philosophy. And so, yeah, this text is a bit dreamlike, which I'm taking that from Tom DeRosa's post about this text on the museum site.
Yeah, it kind of feels like riding a wave.
Yeah.
Like you're being pulled into the shore and then you're immediately pulled right back out. So it's kind of like riding a current.
Yeah.
And you don't know where it's going to pull you. And it is a really fun text to read.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I wouldn't say it's necessarily, I think you found it easier than I did. I don't think it's necessarily easy, but I don't think you need to understand everything to get something from it.
I think you have to approach it like empty hand. I think the more you know, the worse it reads. So I think not knowing anything about Freud does kind of help, because then you're just along for the ride.
Yeah. Yeah. So this work later continues in his work, The Ego and the Id, which was in 1923. And it seems like he also continues to rewrite bits of this text after publication. At least that's kind of evident from the copy that we had in editor footnotes. And for reference, our text was translated and edited by James Strachey, and it was published by W.W. Norton and Company. So that's the one we have.
Yes, and it's also good to mention in the show notes, we will include the Sigmund Freud Foundation. And there they translated all the texts and they're free to read. So if you don't want to pay for this, you don't have to. The reason we use this particular text, I thought it was interesting because it had a little bit more notes and a little bit more footnotes. So for us who are not experts on Freud, it really does help a little bit more than the free version that they have.
So I kind of see this text as not him solely communicating an idea. He is communicating ideas, but I think it's more him trying to think through a problem that he's having. And you can see evidence of this on page 18 in our version, where he says, it is further an attempt to follow out an idea consistently out of curiosity to see where it will lead. And then he says on page 22, I know that these remarks must sound very obscure, but I must limit myself to these hints. So you get the impression that he's just trying to draw out what he's saying to its logical conclusion. And I mean logical for him, which I think is very interesting. The book is written, or the essays?
Yeah, it's divided by like Roman numerals. And I feel like that's just like his methodological process.
Yeah, he's writing like essays that kind of continue on from each other, but they're kind of dealing with a singular problem in and of themselves. So I think it's interesting. Our version of the book actually had artwork on it, and I want Paula to kind of talk a bit more about that because I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, let me pull up the date. So I'm going to go really quickly through this, and I'm using mostly my own memory from when I studied art in my undergrad. So the cover for ours is Pablo Picasso's 1907 painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is currently at the MoMA. It's one of my favorite paintings. It is a fascinating painting. It is a painting that Picasso made of these women sex workers in Avignon. And like what he's playing with like Les Demoiselles is like the ladies of Avignon. So basically the brothel. And it was originally titled The Brothel of Avignon, but he had to change it up because it's the early 1900s and it's a little bit racy. But he had made this painting in 1907 and it was first debuted at the Salon d'Inta. And then it was moved to the MoMA, I believe in the 30s. This is going off of memory. So what's really interesting about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is that it sort of plays with what you're attracted to. So at the very bottom of the canvas is this like very angular table with fruit basket on there. And when you see the painting in person, it almost feels like you're falling into the brothel. In the middle, you have these two women posed, one looking as if lying down on her back, ready to receive pleasure. But to the left, there is a woman pulling down a curtain as if to shut away these women, and then towards the right in like this fractured, almost crystalline background that almost looks like crumpled bed sheets is this masked naked woman. One of them is seated, squatting down, like face turned towards you, and the other one's like holding these like sheets open almost, and they look horrifying. They're almost repulsive. So you're kind of going into this like case of juxtaposition of being attracted to these middle women, seeing their like exposed breast and potentially even seeing their exposed genitals, inviting you in. But the very concept is also repulsive because there is a consequence to giving in to these brothel, giving in to these sex workers. There's potential like diseases, there's potential accidental pregnancies, and there's also a bit of race play in this because, you know, Avignon is othered by the French, you know, so it's going into these things that you really want. It's that pull to do the thing that you're not supposed to do, and yet you still do it. So this painting is really interesting because it really does connect to the main thesis, or one of the main proponents of this essay, which is the death drive.
And so rather than, I guess, go through this text how we sort of usually do, where we go through bits and quotes, and I think it's better to just go through the definitions and then we pull from the text where necessary, because he says a lot of interesting things and it's all kind of colliding together in this piece. So the pleasure principle, which, you know, this is beyond the pleasure principle, we're getting beyond there, and this definition comes from the American Psychological Association, is the view that human beings are governed by their desire for gratification, pleasure, and for a discharge of tension that builds up as pain, or as Freud kind of defines it, as unpleasure, which is really interesting, when gratification is lacking. And for Freud, it is a psychic force that motivates people to seek immediate gratification of instinctual or kind of libidinal impulses, you know, sex, hunger, thirst, and elimination. It dominates the id, which I will define, and operates most strongly during childhood. You know, one of the things that Freud is well known for is his Oedipus complex, which again I'll define a little bit later.
He also has done studies on like how children play, which is a really important part of this text.
Yeah. And so later in childhood, your kind of need to seek this immediate gratification is opposed by the reality principle of the ego. Again, I will define all of this, but this is also called sometimes the pleasure pain principle. So the id, ego, and superego, coined by Freud, he does mention it beforehand, but he specifically goes into it in the text after this one, the ego and the id, has been described through the metaphor of a horse and chariot. And this is through The Guardian, weirdly. They just had like a random page with just this on it.
Sometimes they do good work. Sometimes.
But I thought this was really helpful. At least it was helpful for me. So if you think of the id as the horse, and this is the instinctive, unevolved part of your brain, it's responsible for your urges, your desires that you try and repress, which is why when you're a child, you don't think to repress it. You want that thing and you want it now. You know, like best example I can give is when a child, I guess, is trying to speak and communicate with you something, and then they cry because they can't communicate. They get really frustrated. The ego is the driver of the chariot and the rational part of your brain. So it guides the id, but it actually never has full control. Your ego, the ego isn't how we think of it today. We often use ego to refer to self-esteem. Like if you've got a wounded ego, you've got kind of a wounded pride. But it is instead, in Freud's definition, the most conscious part of your brain. And then the superego, which is wild. The superego is the chariot driver's father sitting behind him and pointing out his mistakes. It's the part of our brain responsible for criticism and moralizing.
Honestly, it does feel like when I was taking driver's ed.
So you have unrestricted part of your brain in the id. The ego, it takes over more as you get older. You know, it's trying to guide the id, and then you have the superego trying to guide all of this mess.
It's what tells you what's a bad idea, and like the superego also isn't like a bad thing. It is lessons taught by your parents, like, hey, don't plug a fork into a live socket. You will get shocked or die. So it can be these built up lessons that are in the back of your brain. And this is where Freudian studies can go into sort of sociological processes of like inserting like culture and what you learn from your culture and why you learn these things and then how this is inherited down. So not an entirely useless text.
And I think you raise a good point. The id, ego, and superego is not the same for everybody. And not that I understand it all, but what he's particularly interested in when he's researching children playing is why they play in certain ways. Like an example he gives in this text, which is really fascinating, is he's looking at this child and this child keeps throwing their toys away and saying the toy is gone. And then like kind of gets joy when he finds it again, or he gets his mum to find it. And then he relates it really fascinatingly to the child's father is gone on the front lines. And so he's relating the way the child is thinking about gone and finding something again to the way the child feels about his father.
Yeah, kind of like a boomerang. It will go, but eventually it will come back to you. And why he's using children is it's the simplicity of the explanation. Children are still developing, so their actions and reactions are kind of in its pure state. So if a child's upset, you can tell because they're crying, or if they're angry, they can tell because they try to hit you. If they are hungry, they make gestures. Like it's a very communicative thing. But as you become an adult, that gone and then come back becomes a lot more complicated, a lot more muddled, a lot more gray. And this is where the id, ego, and superego sort of like go into the complex emotions and mental stability and eventual, what we're going to talk about briefly, like dreams that come about because you're waiting for the thing to come back.
Yeah. So Freud is really well known for how he thinks about dreams and the study of dreams. He says on page 7 of the copy that we've got, the study of dreams may be considered the most trustworthy method of investigating deep mental processes. Now, dreams occurring in traumatic neurosis, I will define later, have the characteristic of repeatedly bringing the patient back into the situation of his accident, a situation from which he awakes in another fright. The patient is, as one might say, fixated to his trauma. So he finds dreams very interesting, and he is in opposition to a lot of people around his time who saw dreams as pointless. You even get that today, right? You have people say dreams are nothing. They're just your brain doing things. But he was like, no, I actually think dreams hold meaning. And so, contrary, I guess, to common belief, there is no dream dictionary. If your teeth fall out in your dreams, it doesn't mean the same thing for everybody. But he instead feels that dream elements are symbolic and have private meanings that can be discovered through the dreamer's association. So he calls this method free association, in which a psychiatrist would get a patient to relax and tell the psychiatrist what their dreams mean to them. And it's getting them to think through their issues and their problems and why they might be dreaming about something. And then he goes one step further because he's
Freud.
And he says that dreams are disguised fulfillments of repressed infantile wishes. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but
yeah, like, this is where we're not sure, bestie. But there is that thing, I'm going to be vulnerable. I've been very anxious recently, and my anxiety has manifested in having really bad dreams and clenching my mouth to the point where I shattered one of my teeth. Speaking of teeth. So I would be dreaming. I still dream now about my teeth accidentally shattering and falling out because it's based on a very instinctual fear of I'm clenching my mouth really tight because I'm anxious. And then it becomes a cycle of anxiety.
Yeah.
But obviously this is a very direct correlation. But I think this is where Freud is a lot of bit misunderstood.
Yeah, definitely.
Because this is a valid thing within psychology. When you have bad dreams, you tell your doctor or psychologist, hey, I've been having these anxiety dreams. And it's not that they're going to sit down and interpret it, but they're going to be okay, what's happening in your life currently that's making you have these dreams? Are you, some people have food anxiety dreams where if they eat a certain food, they just get nightmares. Mm-hmm. But for my family, it's pizza before bed. We cannot have that before bed. We will have bad dreams.
The cheese before bed thing. Oh my God.
It's for me, it's real. But there might be, us with the PhD, we have anxiety, and the anxiety manifests differently within our dreams. And sometimes it does connect these other anxious points for us, and they show up in our dreams because that's what our brain is doing. That's what our brain is trying to process.
Yeah. So about Freud being misunderstood, I haven't looked at it in a while, but in a module I used to teach on, that was kind of one of the endpoints, is that Freud's theories around sex and libido and sexuality are often overemphasized, and were overemphasized after his death in order to sell his ideas, especially towards an American market. I can't say any more than that because it's been a while.
There's also a link
interesting.
Of anti-Semitism also involved in this, especially during his time period with the Nazis. They basically threw away everything of Freud's because he's a Jewish man, and sort of started leading on to Jung. And I thought it was kind of funny to see Jung being quoted within this text. So it's not like they were completely on different lanes, but they were sort of working off of each other, which is very interesting. Yeah. But yes, I 100% agree. There's a lot of elements to the denial of Freud, and also there is a pop cultural thing with Freud. There, he's memed in The Simpsons. He's a pop culture icon, to say the least.
And so, moving on from the pleasure principle, one of the main things he's trying to figure out for most of it is something called the repetition compulsion. And so this is an exception to the pleasure principle in which people compulsively repeat experiences in absence of any evident payoff. For example, soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder who have traumatic dreams in which they're still at war, he couldn't understand why you would dream about something so painful. Like you were saying with anxiety dreams, like why we repeatedly engage in behaviors and consciously and unconsciously return to painful things when it's not providing us any pleasure, right? And so he extrapolates from this the death instinct or the death drive. He calls it the death instinct in the text, but when you Google it, everyone's just talking about the death drive. So I think he must coin that later.
I think it's also a translation thing.
Might be that,
because also death drives just sounds a little bit nicer.
Yeah,
because it's a duh repetition of sound.
I'm gonna try and define it, and maybe Paula can, because I understood it to a point, and then I didn't understand it anymore. And so it's this idea that dissolution is present in all living things. So life arises from inorganic material, and individual living entities return to that state in death. Death and inorganicity also represent the complete absence of stimulation. Individuals verge on returning to that state on a smaller scale insofar as they strive towards the reduction of stimulation. And the aim expressed by stimulation is the aim expressed by the pleasure principle. And so some other definitions that I got, because I was like very confused, that came from the American Psychological Association, I believe. So he conceives as the death instinct as operating in opposition to the life instinct, which later go on to kind of subsume the sexual and the ego instinct of his former kind of schemata. And his ideas around these things. So he's kind of rewriting his own ideas. But the death drive is a drive towards death and destruction, often expressed through behaviors such as aggression, repetition, compulsion, and self-destructiveness. Originally proposed by Sabrina Spielren, I got this from Wikipedia, so don't come for me if it's wrong, in 1912, Freud takes this up again in his paper, and the death drive opposes eros, which is the tendency towards survival, propagation, sex, and other creative life-reproducing drives, sometimes referred to as thanatos.
Yeah, so I like to explain the death drive through example. It's when you are standing on a ledge, and it's very frightening, but there's a little voice in your head, even if you don't have this instinct within you, it's telling you to jump, because there is a pleasure in knowing that that instantaneous death will relieve you of all your stresses. You has to worry about bank statements if they're dead. So it's this moment of like ecstasy at the thought of your own ending. And with that, you can go even build it up with people who are addicted to drugs. It is a self-destructive action, and yet you're craving it. There is a pleasure in your own destruction. And, we do this in small ways, like when we procrastinate, we know that we shouldn't do it, but it feels good to do it. So the death drive, I like to explain it more through those terms, because when you go into actually defining it once more, it's not something you can kind of touch. It slips, it moves, it's its own weird thing. But he explains it it's like, yes, it's not fun, but there is like this enjoyment of it. And like we are organically moving towards this because there is something within our bodies that really propels it, and how it manifests, it depends on the person. Does that make sense?
Kind of reminds me, and I don't know if this is off base, but do you know in like science fiction, and sometimes happens in fantasy, there's conversations that happen around eternal life, and often where people land is eternal life is hell. Like it's not a good thing, and it's not a thing you want, because nobody should live forever.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if it's connected also to that notion that I don't think people want to die necessarily. They just accept it as a part of life.
I think it also depends on your circumstances. Like if you're poor and you're giving eternal life, you're going to be poor forever.
Yeah.
But it goes into like vampires is why we're scared of them, and like they take pleasure in our pain. I recently watched Vampire's Kiss with Nicolas Cage.
Why? Is this part of your Nicolas Cage spreadsheet?
My Cage-assance? No.
If you don't, you will not know what we're talking about. I don't know why I'm saying if you don't. But Paola, one day, when we were still living together, decided to create a spreadsheet of all Nicolas Cage's movies and then decided to watch them all. I don't know what else is on this spreadsheet.
Lots of things. I gave up. It's so many movies. Anyways.
And not all of them are good.
Back to Vampire's Kiss. Actually, kind of relevant to the Freud stuff. It is, because you don't know if he's dreaming or not. Anyways, when the vampire sinks her teeth into his neck, he has a moment of pain and then immediate pleasure. Like, it is ecstasy. He is seen to be developing something below throughout the sequence, like there is a sexual instinct towards that pain. So Freud is going somewhere with this because he's seeing people come back like shell shock. These are like, that's the more extreme example. Like, it's not deriving pleasures and like, yeah, this is enjoyable, but it is the instinct to go back to a place that is unpleasurable, in his own words, and still repeat it. And there is a sort of stability there because it's bad, and that bad stability can become addicting. It's people that don't want to leave their depression because there is a comfort there. So the death drive is it can either lead to one's own death, like you're doing something to like till you die, or it is this propulsion within you that cannot help but to go towards the place where you shouldn't go.
So this is the main crux of this essay. But surrounding all of this is loads and loads of different random terms, which I'm going to go through and hopefully it will make sense to you. And so part of what the ego is driven by, especially when you're older, is something called the reality principle. Again, American Psychological Association is coming in clutch.
USA, baby.
But in kind of classic psychoanalysis, which is what we're in, it is the representation of demands of the external world and requires the individual to forego or modify instinctual gratification or postpone it to a more appropriate time. In contrast to the pleasure principle, dominated by the id, done more so in childhood, the reality principle is connected to the ego and controls impulses and enables to people to kind of be more rational and effectively live their life in ways that are not just impulsive decisions one after another.
It's like saving up for like an expensive pair of shoes instead of putting on a credit card immediately.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what is also, I guess, if we're connecting to the pleasure principle and the death drive, this is all within there. What he's also talking about, particularly towards the beginning of this essay, is something called traumatic neurosis, which you're not going to believe it is connected to sign signifier. And no, I won't be defining all of that again. I will tell you what signifier is, though.
Here we go again, baby.
So traumatic neurosis is kind of caused by an external event, and the interpretation of the event is the source of a piece of knowledge that has the power to destabilize a theory that partly define the subject. So lots of words, right? Essentially, there's no signifier that represents a psychic experience. So the signifier, if we remember, is the sign's physical form. So like a sound, printed image, words, it's distinct from the meaning of the sign. And so, for example, if you're on your computer and you're on a website and you see like a button grayed out on the website, you know that button is probably inactive, but there's nothing really telling you that. It's literally just signifying that that is the case.
Dead link.
Yeah. And so the signifier represents the psychic experience, which can be repressed, denied, etc. And these defense mechanisms protect the psyche from trauma, but can lead to the creation of neurotic symptoms. Basically, you're repressing certain things in order to protect your brain. But the way your brain works is it's repressing them often without you knowing that this is happening. And that leads to, like you're saying, anxiety, neurosis, stress, depression, all these things, which he's trying to understand partly what traumatic neurosis is, especially in connection to shell shock.
It is the early formations of PTSD. This is why this is sort of also a really revolutionary text, because it's trying to comprehend, and I think not doing badly, on what PTSD looks like, and then specifically defining complex PTSD. And there's also childhood PTSD. So it's all these things sort of like rummaging in his mind with this little pipe attached to his mouth, just being like, what does this mean? And yeah, there is that element to it. And it's like, why does this sound immediately trigger this person? Like a balloon popping or the sound of fireworks, things that are, for us, associated to something pleasurable can immediately turn to someone's unpleasurable emotion.
Yeah. So repression is understood by Freud as a defense mechanism that ensures that what is unacceptable to the conscious mind and would, if recalled, arouse anxiety, is prevented from entering into it. So kind of like what we're saying here, but that is also connected to traumatic neurosis. It plays for Freud a major reason for mental illnesses and affecting the psyche of people. And so repression is connected to resistance, which is an unconscious process and is what happens when patients, and it is a problematic term, it's what happens when patients refuse to accept proper treatment as a form of avoidance, right?
Yeah.
But again, it's problematic because it places the blame solely on the patient rather than trying to work around what is happening.
I mean, we need to also remember that this is a time period of lobotomies. Lobotomies weren't even banned in the US till like the 60s or something crazy like that. They fell out of favor. They fell out of favor in the 50s and 60s, and then in like 67 they stopped doing it.
Yeah, so that's a long time for like shoving ice picks into people's brains, basically.
Exactly. And also these people did not have the medical licenses for it. 1, 2. And also it's interesting that Freud is saying all these things when he's also writing against shock therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe 2 reasons. One reason, which is very likely, is Freud is a biologist and he knows that maybe throwing electricity into people's brains, not the best thing to do. And then here's what I actually think. I think he thought they were coming for his bag. He's like, I believe it only in talk therapy, especially through me. I take checks. Thanks.
Yeah.
Debit or credit. Oh my God, can you imagine Freud with one of those little square things? You know, like the little tap pay things that they have.
Oh my God, yeah.
Can you imagine? He's like, anyways, Oedipus.
Yeah.
That'll be $7.75.
Oh, I will quickly define the Oedipus complex because
Oh no, we can naturally go. We're gonna cut this bit out.
No. I like it. Let's keep it all in. It's random. So the Oedipus complex, I've mentioned it throughout. It kind of surfaces and then disappears in this paper. But the Oedipus complex is the idea that a child is attached to the parent of the opposite sex. He does associate connection to the libido, sexuality here, but it's accompanied by envious and aggressive feelings towards the parent of the same sex. Yeah, we ignore that.
Yeah, actually, to bring back our good old boys, Deleuze and Guattari, they did write a book called Anti-Oedipus, and it's going against sort of these like Freudian psychoanalytic concepts of schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And going into the capitalism behind diagnosis and all these things. So yeah, I just think it's so funny because Freud is so connected to post-structuralism.
Yeah, in wild ways.
In that they're trying to unwind everything he's done.
And he's like, you'll never let me go.
Gorilla grip.
So another main thing throughout kind of loads of his theories, a kind of cornerstone, is his idea of unconscious. So how would you basically describe the conscious and unconscious? The conscious is things you're aware of. The unconscious is things you're not aware of.
The unconscious is what's lingering underneath.
Yeah.
It is the things that you have no control over, the things that will show up because it is embedded within your mind and and if you believe in the soul, you believe it's the attachment of your soul. It is these things that like show up when you don't want them to. You cannot control them. And that also ties into interpretation of dreams and all this type of thing. It's the parts of yourself that it's even mysterious to you. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, that's good. And so in Freud's notions and ideas, he says that ideas can be both unconscious and active at the same time, which is interesting. Repression, if you're repressing an unconscious thought, it doesn't diminish the intensity of that thought. It just moves it somewhere else, basically. Mm-hmm. Wishful impulses, which we don't have time to go into here, but his idea of wish is really interesting, and I will include some links.
With repression, I thought it was really interesting that he said it could also manifest physically. Mm-hmm. So people with anxiety who dig their fingernails into their skin, or like when you bite off, like this is my own bad habit. I bite the skin around my like thumbs, mm-hmm. and it's a way of expressing that anxiety. And you do it unconsciously. You just do it because it's how you're going through it. And then when you notice that you're doing it, you stop. But it doesn't stop it from still occurring.
Yeah, so wishful impulses then assert themselves and influence in our lives, with repression kind of keeping them at bay. And interestingly, the unconscious can allow contradictory ideas to sit side by side. Mm-hmm. So again, these ideas don't have to necessarily make a logical sense. And he says in this paper, actually, and this is where he was going into time, the unconscious does not represent ideas in chronological order. And so that it doesn't have certainty, and it doesn't have a temporal fixity, I guess.
And that is what a lot of artists, especially from the early 20th century, are so attached to Freud, especially artists like Salvador Dali, who use these concept of like, what would the unconscious look like? Like, what is time if time doesn't exist in this space, in this liminal space? So it is really interesting how like these ideas are then projected onto a canvas, because I feel like Freud would have a field day with this.
And so another term that he comes up with, another kind of neurosis, is the transference neurosis. Again, big up the American Psychological Association. You're going to have all the references and everywhere where I'm getting this information.
We're going to have to send them like, I love you.
Love you, your hearts. Unless you're doing things that are problematic.
No, the APA is pretty good.
Okay, good.
From what I know.
So
don't add us, please.
So the transference process is where patients displace or project onto an analyst, so a psychotherapist and stuff, unconscious feelings and wishes originally directed towards important individuals. And so the neurosis comes from and is released through this transference process. And this is part of, I guess, as far as I understand it, part of his psychoanalytical progress, because it happens by reviving and reliving patients' early conflicts and traumas. I don't know if anybody's ever been through this, but when you're with a therapist and you're talking about your situation and then it makes you feel worse, like often, I think people don't talk about it enough, that therapy often makes you feel really bad. And so you start to dread, I guess, going into those sessions because you're transferring the negativity onto the sessions and onto that therapist, when actually that's not what's happening.
Yeah, it's the processing of an emotion, and it's being triggered by this person because they're the ones asking.
Yeah. And so he argues that transference neurosis must be resolved if the patient is to free themselves from harmful effects of the past experience. So he's saying, like, we've just got to get through this, basically.
Which is not wrong.
And so part of, I think, connected to this is his theory of projection, which is a mental process, which is so fascinating because I think this happens all the time now, is a mental process in which people attribute to others what is in their own mind. So it's literally, right? I feel like this was me yesterday. Individuals who are in a self-critical state, consciously or unconsciously, may believe other people are critical of them, but actually it's you being critical of yourself.
I see it a lot as a joke when like queer people call other people also queer, and they're not. They're like, no, but I know because I can see it, and you're like, bestie.
Yeah, but Freud borrows this term from neurology. Oh my God. Okay, this is a completely separate term from anything, but it does come up in the text. But I thought you would find it particularly interesting. So he mentions cathesics randomly. Not so randomly, I guess. It's basically the idea that you invest libidinal energy into an object or energy. So, for example, if you have sentimental attachment to a keepsake or family heirloom or a photograph, that's an example. Another example, it really fascinatingly, is patriotism and other feelings like that.
You are bringing me down a path where I want to yell for like 3 hours straight. And that would be a patron exclusive if we ever get one.
Literally. And so, yeah. So those are kind of all the main points that he kind of brings up in this thesis.
Oh my, Hannah, you did a fantastic job.
Thank the internet, which has done most of the legwork.
No. You know who we need to thank? The American Psychological Association.
Yes, and the Freud Museum, because loads of my sources were from there as well.
Honestly, perfect.
Thank you so much for doing the work for me.
Big fans, besties.
But I wanted to end, well, we've got two endings. We've got an ending to our actual discussion of the text, and then we're going to get into some media, which I'm so excited for. You have no idea. So the ending of the text, I'm just going to read like a quote. On page 57 and 58 of our text, he says that the pleasure principle seems to actually to serve the death instincts. This in turn raises a host of other questions in which we can, at present, find no answer. We must be patient and await fresh methods and occasions of research. We must be ready to abandon a path that we have followed for a time, even if it seems to be leading to no good end. Only believers who demand that science shall be a substitute for the catechism they have given up will blame an investigator for developing or even transforming his views. We may take comfort, too, for the slow advances of our scientific knowledge, in the words of a poet.
Was man nicht erfliegen kann, muss man erhinken. Die Schrift sagt, es ist keine Sünde zu hinken. It's translated to, what we cannot reach flying, we must reach limping. The book tells us it is no sin to limp.
Which I was screaming. And I was also screaming because on my email, I've got a quote at the end of my email that comes from Jeff Vandermeer's 2014 book, Annihilation, which first book is amazing. Don't read the rest. Just read the first book. I'm sorry, Jeff Vandermeer, but if you're listening. But he ends the book by saying, I'm aware that all this speculation is incomplete, inexact, inaccurate, and useless. If we don't have real answers, it's because we don't know what questions to ask. Our instruments are useless, our methodology broken, and our motivations are selfish. And basically Freud's saying it. And I think that's so fascinating, right?
Yeah, I think it's also amazing that Freud's like, this is what I have for right now. This is all I can work with. And he's also kind of saying, like, don't fully rely on science. Mm-hmm. Like, there's only so much we can explain. And this is where I was telling Hannah, I felt a really deep connection with queer theory and its associations to Freud. Like, this is why I don't think these things can be unstuck. Obviously, Freud works within a binary with very bourgeois, straight, heterosexual people. But this belief that, like, there is something beyond what's comprehensible, and, like, that is what the death drive is going towards, this infinite sort of doom, quote unquote. It is so influential into how we think about binary and how things function. Like, why are we attracted to someone regardless of a biological inclination that supposedly we all have? That's what separates sex from gender. That's what separates cultural instinct and familial instinct and the personal. It's very fascinating. And then to end it with a poem on a scientific text, it's sort of this early 90s queer theory methodology of introducing these scientific concepts and then putting it with literature. Like, we did that for Sedgwick.
Yeah.
So at the end of this, I kind of was reminded of Sedgwick.
Yeah, and Halberstam does it as well. Like, it starts their chapters with, like, pop culture. Madagascar, I think, was the one.
Oh, SpongeBob was one of them.
Yeah.
Billy Budd.
Oh my God, don't talk about Billy Budd again.
All right, so with this, I think we're just kind of concluding. I think we both really liked the text.
But surprisingly, I did not expect to like it, but it was so fascinating. And I don't want you to come away from this podcast thinking that we necessarily agree with everything that Freud is saying. What I do find particularly interesting, especially like the end of this essay, is it is kind of mind-opening. It gets you to think, and what I think is also really interesting is the ways we can connect it to other things that we already know about, which I just love this podcast, and I love understanding theory for this reason.
Yeah, it's sort of like connecting the dots.
Yeah.
For like a lot of, like, it's once more, you cannot take out Freud. I'm sorry. He is the ever-present ghost of contemporary theory. Like, I'm sorry. You can hate him all you want. You need to be a hater to move on.
Literally, I always say that, you were talking about binaries earlier. I think you can't actually deconstruct a binary unless you understand what a binary is. And so Freud is kind of that, right? This is what we mean by it's like joining a lot of the pieces. Like, we did the post-structuralism episode. This shows that in a different light, I guess.
Yeah, and with this, we're going to move on to media. It would have been super funny to have done fan fiction for this one.
Yeah, but I did look, by the way, and it was scary.
It's frightening.
Just pre-warning, if you look up Freud on AO3 or anywhere, it's a very lawless land. It's scary vibes.
Yeah, so we do not recommend. Unless you're into that, and then go ahead. I will go first because I'm less passionate.
I'm so passionate. Get ready.
So,
although yours is fascinating, you were showing me, and I'm into it.
So my connection is The Sopranos. So when I first told Hannah this, Hannah was like, "Excuse me, what?"
Yeah.
The show about mobsters, and I say, yes, the show about mobsters. If you don't want to be spoiled for a 10-year plus show, sorry, log off now. You've had 10 years. And if you're 10 years old, why are you listening to this? Anyways, so I want to recommend this paper called What's Out of Sight is Not Out of Mind, Psychoanalysis and the Sound in the Sopranos by Morgan Berry for Boston University. And it basically goes into something I noticed when I first started watching The Sopranos a couple years ago, which was the connection of dream interpretation within The Sopranos and the effects of sound. So to sort of show Hannah a vibe of these dream sequences, it will be included in the show notes. It is a scene from season 2 called Fever Dreams. And it's basically Tony Soprano is having a lot of these anxieties because he may be dying. And in this dream, he's seeing people that he's killed, and he's leaving them at the pier, and they're kind of behind. And one of the people that he's leaving behind is one of his supposed homies that is basically that he has a feeling that is doing something against him. And it's interesting in the dream that he's left behind with the other dead. and it's only his like main crew that follow him towards another pier, and he lights himself on fire. And it's a flash, it's an instant. And ultimate spoilers, sorry Hannah as well, but the end of the Sopranos, like the season finale, if you haven't seen it, cut out now. Basically it's this like, it's Don't Stop Believing, the song playing in the background. It's him sitting down with his family. He's waiting for his daughter to arrive. You see a door open and you hear like the bell ringing of the door opening, and then he turns and it's "Don't stop," and then it cuts there and it's just black. And people were pissed off when it came out. But what that actually means is it's the connection of sound, like the ringing of the bell, like basically you're going to die. So that "Don't stop" and that cut to black is him being shot and finally killed. I think it's a really interesting show. It centers around psychology, the psychology of a person who's not a good person, whose super ego and id are in a scatter plot formation. None of us connected. It's him going through medication and like this impulse of wanting to do horrible things. Anyways, it's a great show. I feel like every like frat boy at a party in undergrad just being like, "Have you seen The Sopranos? It's like super good." But it actually is really good.
As soon as you connected it to Freud, I was like, wait, I'm in.
Yeah, because I was originally going to do one of my favorite TV shows, which is Twin Peaks, where you can definitely go into dream interpretation with that.
I thought you were going to do that, actually, and then, yeah.
But I took a left turn, baby. I went towards Tony Soprano. Okay, so for the podcast, I just showed you the season finale. How do you feel about it?
That is actually way more frightening than
Like, what you were expecting.
Yeah.
It's the suddenness of that death. Yeah. So yeah, that was my inclusion for this podcast. I thought it was a more interesting choice than Twin Peaks, because Twin Peaks, it has a lot of fantastical elements to it, which would take a little bit of time as well to explain, and you haven't finished all of it.
No, not yet.
So I don't also want to spoil you on something I have not yet finished. Although I just spoiled you The Sopranos.
No, I will watch that though, because that is interesting.
But I feel your connection is so cool, Hannah.
Oh my God. So, right, picture me yesterday being like, so I've been playing Persona 3 Reloaded, which was, they've kind of redone Persona 3 and put it onto newer consoles. And I've never played Persona 3. This is my first time playing it. And I've also played Persona 5. I've also played a bit of Persona 4. So I'm into the Persona series. And the Persona series is essentially a JRPG, so like a role-playing game. And the main idea behind it is, part of it is like school kids, like high school kids, going to school and living their school life, and you get skills, and then you go into like fantastical kind of dungeon crawling, and that is the main game. Very interesting. You build up relationships. So interesting. So I was like, why is all of this psychoanalysis reminding me of Persona? I was like, that's so weird. Let me look it up. And turns out, some of it is connected to Freud, but actually it's connected to Carl Jung's particular practice of psychoanalysis. So I kind of want to go through some of this, because I cannot explain how crazy like that felt to me yesterday, being like, wait, the pieces have slotted together in my brain.
She was screaming on a voice note about it.
And so I want to explain Persona 3 in particular, because I think that connects most to Freud versus the other ones. But Persona 3, imagine personas as reflections of the soul, but they are creatures that exist. And I'm trying to explain it in a way that makes sense to anybody who's not played Persona. They're like reflections of the soul. The main character can have multiple personas, which is not a usual thing. Usually you just have one. And the way you get your persona to come out is at midnight in Persona 3, you enter what's called the dark hour, and it's an additional hour that exists outside of normal time. And most people do not wake up during the dark hour, or like,
It's kind of like the witching hour.
oh my God. But if you don't wake up during this dark hour, you're represented as a person in a coffin. Yeah. The persona is so good.
I'm going to be watching a Let's Play on this.
Literally, you should. It's so good. If you can wake up during this time, you're just like a normal person. And you are a part of a group called C's. I forget what this actually stands for. But the C's people have guns. And what they do to release their persona is shoot themselves in the head. Right?
Yeah, Hannah showed me one of the sequences from the game, and I was like,
yeah, it is intense. And so you follow the protagonist who is balancing their daily life with going to school and building relationships with others while fighting kind of shadows in the dark hour. And really interestingly, you fight these shadows, and the dungeon crawling is in a building that replaces the school building. And it's kind of like this really big, scary maze type place. And what the main theme around Persona 3 is high school students trying to cope with, understand, and accept death in a world surrounded by it. The other games work in slightly different ways. So like Persona 5, you're specifically kind of cat burglars trying to specifically target bad people.
But the way you're describing Persona 3, it reminds me of Sucker Punch.
Yeah. It gives the same kind of vibes, which, by the way, Minds Mike just did an episode about Sucker Punch that was
I
10 out of 10.
screamed.
It was so good.
It's so good.
And so connected to all of this is tarot card symbolism. And so each of the personas and the individuals you speak to and build relationships with are represented by different tarot cards. And so when you first... your protagonist first shoots himself in the head. It's this big dramatic scene, and his persona first appears as Orpheus, which is a figure in Greek mythology associated with music. It's obviously a very dramatized kind of JRPG representation of this. But what happens then, which I was not, I promise you I was shocked. I played obviously the other Persona games, and then I came to this and I was like, that persona gets ripped apart by another persona called Thanatos, which I mentioned earlier when talking about the kind of death drive, right? Sometimes referred to as Thanatos. And this is a persona that comes from the Death Arcana. It's introduced in a horrendous way. It rips open Orpheus, like comes out of its face, rips it open. Obviously, this is all cartoons, so it's less horrifying.
It's also like a connection to Greek mythology.
Yeah. And so you then can't access that persona till later in game, and you have to like max out somebody's relationship, and then you have to fuse together all the personas of the Death Arcana to make this one. So it's really interesting. I'll include like a link to somebody talking about the kind of the shadows of persona, the personas, the collective unconsciousness of these kind of dream worlds. And there's so much in here. It's really fascinating. But yeah.
Try as you might, you cannot escape Papa Freud.
Yeah, literally. So yeah. That's our episode on Freud.
Yeah, I hope you liked it. We had a lot of fun, and if nothing makes sense, bring it up to our lawyers.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye!